Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to this special evening with 7 outstanding writers, all from different countries. This is the closing event of the first Passaporta seminar, a new initiative of the International House of Literature, Passaporta, based in the Rue d'Ansart. Passaporta not only organizes literary events, but also wants to increase the knowledge of other literatures, to offer a platform for reflection on literature and to promote literary exchange. Our intention with the seminar is to create time and space for a selection of writers to discuss the essence of writing and to cultivate thought-provoking interaction. Indeed, writers meet quite often during festivals or other events in the public sphere, but seldom have the opportunity to spend time with colleagues and share experiences on the writing process. During the last 3 days, the 7 writers you will be able to meet tonight have been spending time together on the countryside to talk about the time of the author. It resulted in 3 exceptionally inspiring days of keynotes and discussions, the reports of which you can find on the Passaporta blog. The time of the author will reoccur as a focal theme throughout the next year, most prominently during the celebration of Passaporta's 10th anniversary in October 2014 and the Passaporta Festival of Literature in spring 2015. Literature is often requested to keep up to date and be aware of events, but what exactly does that mean? Should literature deal with current topics or express the spirit of the age? How does the writer relate to the news that he or she never entirely has under control? What is the time the author requires, makes, and possesses? Tonight, the 7 writers will share their keynotes, insights, and discussions about all these questions. Host of the seminar and of tonight's event is Ortwin de Graaf, Professor of Literature at the University of Leuven. You will be able to listen to Céline Curiol from France, Hermsen from the Netherlands, Iman Humaydan from Lebanon, Christian Grøndahl from Denmark, Provoost from Belgium, Goce Smilevski from Macedonia, and I first give the word to Juan Gabriel Vásquez from Colombia, who is Passaporta's writer in residence during the month of March and who will present a part of his keynote. I wish you an inspiring evening with us.
Thank you, Sigrid. Thank you all for being here. Good evening. I would like to thank Passaporta for the opportunity to be a part of this seminar and for taking such a huge chance. You have just listened to this idea of gathering 7 writers under the same roof for 3 days, and nobody got killed. C'est déjà ça, no? We have been discussing the relationship between the news and writers, or how writers deal with what they see in the media. And the text I presented to my colleagues is called Getting Poems from the News. In 2009, I was in the middle of a very serious literary crisis. This is what writers call writing a novel. I had spent the previous year trying to shape the story of a retired pilot, this middle-aged man who has just been released from prison after serving 20 years for drug trafficking. The story was mostly set in the early 1970s, when Richard Nixon's war on drugs was turning the private vice of marijuana into one of the most lucrative illegal industries in the world, thus creating the first small Latin American mafias, and those mafias, as everyone knows, would subsequently turn into the drug cartels that forever changed the history of my country. The early years of drug trafficking had never been deeply explored in fiction, and I was intent on filling that void. but the effort was going nowhere. After a year's work, all I had to show was 150 pages of prose that seemed distant and unconvincing, although I had put into them everything I knew about writing. Any novelist knows the feeling. You work away at your paragraphs, you incessantly polish your sentences and chisel your adverbs. You go back to your Tolstoy for characterization and to your Flaubert for structure, but somehow the novel still seems far away from you. It seems alien. And you start wondering why it is absolutely necessary that you tell this story. And you begin dreading the moment in which the revelation comes. It is not. It is not necessary. For that story could have been written by anybody else. Lose it and the world remains unchanged. What's worse, you remain unchanged. You discover you were never invested morally, emotionally in these characters, in these anecdotes. You discover the story had never belonged to you. But the gods of literature can sometimes be merciful. One day in June, I opened up a magazine and stumbled upon the photograph of a dead hippo. According to the text, he had belonged to Pablo Escobar's former zoo in the Magdalena Valley. Escobar, the most violent drug lord in the history of the trade, had enjoyed spending millions of dollars on exotic animals. When he was killed in December of 1993, after leading a war against the Colombian state that left at least 6,000 dead and many more traumatized for life, the zoo was seized by the state, and the animals, all but forgotten, began slowly to die or escape. The hippo was one of them. After 2 years spent destroying crops and terrifying peasants, the army, the Colombian army, hunted him down. And there they were in the picture, a bunch of soldiers with rifles surrounding the dead mass of the hippo's body. At first, I didn't quite realize what it was that made me so uncomfortable. But after a while, I noticed that the image of the hunters surrounding the hippo was strikingly similar to the one of the policemen surrounding the dead body of Pablo Escobar himself, just minutes after he was shot down on the rooftops of Medellin. Within seconds, that hippo had become a sort of surreal Madeleine, and I began, for the first time since I had fled Colombia in 1996, remembering that decade in which terrorism, bombings in shopping malls or commercial airplanes, shootings in restaurants or in the streets became commonplace for my generation. And this was my epiphany, that my novel was not about the pilot and his life in the 1970s, but about my generation and its legacy. That it was not about the past wars, but about the present scars and memories. The news of a dead hippo, published in a 2009 magazine, gave me the key to my novel. And so the past, which has always been my obsession, in this novel turned out to be nothing more than the hidden manifestation of a piece of breaking news. My point is that the novelist's relationship with the ghost of the present, at least as they appear in the media, is uneasy and unpredictable, and can't be wrapped up in the comfortable cliché stating that actuality is for journalists, whereas literature always needs time. Of course, literature needs time, if for no other reason than the fact that novels take so long to write. A deep, comprehensive, and thoughtful investigation into a subject, composed in careful language and enriched with a carefully considered outlook on life, will consume several months and quite likely several years, by which time the world has already changed, your original impulse has receded in the distance, and the opinion you had on it has gained new nuances, new gradations of color, new tinges. The opposite impulse, the instinctive and immediate attack on a contemporary subject, can have terrible consequences for a novelist. Colombian novelists know a little bit about that. In the 1950s, while a young Caribbean writer you might have heard about, Gabriel García Márquez, this guy is going places, you have to pay attention to him. When he was trying to publish his first books, the country was succumbing to a civil war that would eventually leave more than 300,000 dead. It was the period we call la violencia, the violence, with a dreadful, appalling, ominous capital V. The daily massacres, as they appeared in the papers, proved very stimulating to emerging as well as established novelists, who began writing about the dead almost before they had time to mourn them. The problem was the novels were no good. In fact, they were a failure. García Márquez was perhaps alone in realizing where the trouble lay. He wrote, "It is understandable that the only national literary explosion we have ever had, the so-called novel of the violence, should represent an awakening to the reality of a literally frustrated country. Without a tradition, the first national drama we were conscious of surprised us unarmed. In order for the complete literary digestion of political violence, a series of pre-established cultural conditions was necessary which would have supported the urgency of artistic expression at a critical moment." This is the end of the quotes. Elsewhere, García Márquez argues that Colombian novelists not only did not enjoy a solid tradition on which to start building their own books, with which to start discussing their own reality, but they didn't even have the ingenuity or basic cunning to realize that they should have taken the time to learn how to write novels before trying to use novels to explore what they saw in the news. Newspapers were too much with them. Their novels became then books with a thesis, pamphlets, a mere, and this is García Márquez again, inventory of deaths. Their fictions, though full of good indignation and humanitarian purposes, are utterly lacking in art. Now, by art, I mean, besides the simple values of style and structure, that kind of deeper perception that is born when the novelist lets the novel think by itself, instead of making it a vehicle for his own limited opinions. Dealing with a news item in fiction is different because fiction tends to think for itself. Novels are more intelligent than their authors. They are more comprehensive, they are smarter than their authors, who are irredeemably tied to prejudices, feebleness, ideology, and even faith. But in recent years, a series of novelists from different traditions have established, willingly or otherwise, a different relationship with documents in general and newspapers in particular. It is a kind of relationship that amounts, I think, to a new poetics. And it has, to my mind, opened up interesting possibilities for novelists as well as for readers, which means only one thing, that novels now go to places which were before unreachable. Today, I would like to explore some of these cases with you. I'm referring to those words that W.G. Sebald, one of the great practitioners of this approach, calls documentary fiction. Dostoevsky in Demons or Flaubert in Madame Bovary used the news as raw material, as part of the creative impulse at a stage before the creative writing begins. Documentary fiction, on the other hand, uses pieces of news as plot points, as part of the argument, as narrative devices, or even as symbols. Take a look, for instance, at the narrator of Sebald's novel Vertigo, who takes a train from Vienna to Venice and then becomes obsessed with the years Casanova spent imprisoned in the Duke's castle. He describes Casanova's disarray and finally his escape. Days later, the same narrator is spending his time in the bar of an Italian hotel, trying to write. Luciana, the woman behind the bar, asks him if he is a journalist or a writer. Sebald says, "When I said that neither the one nor the other was quite right, she asked what it was that I was working on, to which I replied that I did not know for certain, but had a growing suspicion that it might turn into a crime story." At some point, the writing becomes difficult. He writes, "It was the most meaningless, empty, dishonest scrawl." And the narrator, whose name is Sebald, is hugely relieved when somebody arrives bringing newspapers. Most of them were English and French, Sebald writes, but there were also two Italian papers, the Gazzettino and the Alto Adige. As he finishes reading them, an article calls his attention, as well it should. The article announces a play put on stage at the local theater about Casanova's days at the Duke's Palace. Now, what does this mean? What does this coincidence mean? The narrator does not tell us, but he does include a photograph of the article, presumably so that we know he is not lying. The effect is indeed strange, halfway between an objet trouvé and a coincidence. Vertigo was published in German in 1990. In 1998, a Spanish false novel, thus described by its author, Javier Marías, used photographs and press clippings in much the same way. Javier Marías, the narrator of Dark Back of Time, Negra Espalda del Tiempo, meets a couple of old bookshop owners, Mr. and Mrs. Stone. A magazine interviews them. Its pages, the pages of the magazine, are reproduced in the novel with enough quality so that we can read the English text. We even appear in a Spanish novel by Javier Marías, Mr. Ralph Stone says, speaking about Marías' sixth novel, All Souls, Todas las Almas. And then we become aware that we are reading another novel by Marías in which the characters we meet speak within an interview about being included in a book by the author who includes this interview. In a complex narrative built as a house of mirrors and dealing with, among other things, the relationship between fact and fiction, the decision to use this press clipping and let it condition or contaminate everything that comes is not, could ever be gratuitous. In Soldiers of Salamis by Javier Cercas, the narrator is a journalist who publishes an article in the Spanish press that enables the whole plot to unravel. In The Adversary, L'Adversaire, by Emmanuel Carrère, the narrator begins by telling us that on Saturday, 9th January 1993, while he was attending a school meeting with his family, Jean-Claude Roman was murdering his own family. 4 days later, Carrère opens the journal Libération and reads about the murder. And that is the beginning of this extraordinary nonfiction novel. Now, the question you may ask is The Adversary a novel? My answer is, it must be, since it asks the kind of questions novels ask. You might ask, what are those? And I will say, moral questions. It is as simple as that. So you see, the novelist's relationship with the news is not as predictable as we may think. It can manifest in many ways, and our task as novelists is to look closely at these manifestations, understand how they work, and take what literary profit, we can from them. What is valuable in them, whether a piece of news works from the outside or from within the novel, is the transformation of the material. As García Márquez used to say, through the redeeming power of poetry. Or maybe through the virtues of language, pattern, and structure. Or maybe through that indefinable, magical shift of perspective that may have been in Nabokov's mind when he said that the writer should be a storyteller and a teacher, but particularly an enchanter. Or, finally, through that underappreciated weapon that is moral imagination. The ability to fill that newspaper clipping with people and actions larger and more complicated than the ones we know. Complication, I think, is essential. Newspapers are soothing in the sense that they give answers, but fiction is and remains unsettling because all it does, as Chekhov once wrote, is try to find the most interesting questions possible. Literature is news that stays news, said Ezra Pound. I will retort with the help of a few verses by William Carlos Williams. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Juan Gabriel. Humans are singularly touched by time, haunted in the present by echoes from the future, recalling traces of the past. The medium of that haunting is not the flow of life, but the stutter of symbols stitching stuff into history. History is made by humans doing all those things humans do, which is also always to say it is made and made up by the histor, the Greek term for one who judges, a wise person, ultimately one who sees, but then specifically one who sees what is not available as evidence, what is more of the order of the idea and has to be written down to come into being, which is also to say that history belongs to the province of the author, giving it time. It is our privilege tonight to be in the presence of 7 such histors, or histores, whatever the Greek plural of that word might be, 7 authors who have agreed to give us some of their time in thinking about their relation with time. And before we go on, I'll just briefly run you through the program so you know what is going to happen in the next hour and a half or so. I will presently have a conversation, a talk with Goce, Smilevski and Céline Curiol. After that, the Dutch philosopher and author Joke Hermsen will entertain us with what has been called stand-up philosophy on the basis of her just recently published book, Kairos. After that, I will have another conversation with the Lebanese author Iman Humaydan and then our Belgian star Anne Provoost. After which the Danish author Christian Grøndahl will give us another keynote address, and we will conclude with a little talk conversation between our speaker we heard just now, Juan Gabriel Vásquez, and our final speaker, Christian Grøndahl, after which there will be some time for questions and answers. We planned to finish all of that when that says 0. If we don't make that, that's not a big problem, but that's the general idea. So, first on the list then, after the opening, is a talk with Goce, Smilevski and Céline Curiol, who I'd like to invite to join me on the stage now. Goce, Céline, the question I would like to start our talk with involves the relation that an inventor of fiction has to the questions of the contemporary and the historical. Céline, your first novel, Voix sans issue, was an intensely contemporary novel written about somebody pretty much alive and similar to you in some ways, perhaps at the very present of writing in Paris at that time. Obviously not a biographical novel, but a novel about somebody intensely contemporary to you when writing. Goce, your first novel, which has not been translated, and which you tell us you're not entirely happy with, was also very contemporary. And after that you decided to go for philosophical or historical fiction rather, a book about Spinoza and your very successful book about Freud's sister, both intensely historical novels. Could you perhaps, Goce, begin by telling us why you decided to go for the historical rather than the contemporary in inventing your fiction?
First of all, I think we as a human beings are never sure where is the border between past and the present moment. I think that the present reflects the past, and the past somehow contains what is in the presence, in the present time. So, as you said, my first novel was set here and now. Of course, not here. It was set in Macedonia, on the Balkans. And it is a novel about people that I know and about myself, as it is usual very often with the first novel. But later on, I understood that we can speak about ourselves when speaking about others. And actually, the novel about Spinoza was a long time with myself before I wrote it, because for the first time, the idea about writing about him was in the classes of philosophy in a high school. I'm sure as a high school student, I didn't understood his philosophy. And I have to admit, even now, I don't understand maybe what he wrote, although I really tried. But what catch my attention and my emotions was that it was a human being that was excommunicated by his community. So he couldn't communicate even with his own brother and with his own sisters, because if they did, if they tried, they would be excommunicated too. So I think that the idea of loneliness that he experienced is very close to our time too. In a different way, I think the loneliness is somehow our choice, although we can feel we are thrown to it by the society and how society is constructed. This is time of social groups communicating, although it's antisocial. People communicate more and more, and they are more and more lonely. And I think that writing about philosopher from 17th century, I never wanted to write about a hero, but about an ordinary human being with all the sufferings he had. And to read his life through his philosophy. And later on, I continued with writing the Freud sister, which is a novel. For me, it is novel, a metaphor. It's a metaphor about the forgotten people, about the people forgotten by historiography, that remembers influential people, remembers conquerors, remembers men of power, but it forgets the ordinary people. So that was kind of giving a voice to a woman from a 19th century that was forgotten by historiography, that lived in the shadow of the great brother. And somehow she telling her story is a way of telling of a female approach of what it means to be women different than what Freud thought a woman is.
Okay, Céline, I see you nod. Is there a similarity between his portrayal of Freud's sister and your portrayal of your nameless heroine in Voici Ici?
I think for me it's a little different. As you said, I hope this first novel was contemporary, although it wasn't based on my life. But for me, I admire very much what you've done, because as a writer, it was always difficult for me to use historical figures or historical characters, because, and it's really personal, I do feel like we used that term during the seminar, not entitled to telling the story, because I do feel that I do not know this experience. And I have, maybe because I used to be a journalist, maybe because I worked in the news, if I'm talking about something that happened, or historical event or an historical figure, I have this obligation to stick to the fact. And as a writer, my imagination gets stuck. In my latest novel, the project started as a biography of a famous sculptor who is called Isamu Noguchi. He's half Japanese, half American. And my first project, I really wanted to write his biography. And I had all those, documentation information, and I completely got stuck. And the only way I could get out of this was to invent him a son, which he never had. So rather than telling the story of the historical figure, I told the story of this invented son, which was also a way of telling the story of the father, but I needed this imagination to come in. But that's my experience.
You spoke at the seminar also of something that you notice in contemporary fiction, which you, I think, characterize as a kind of a fear of invention, that authors tend to not be daring enough in their imagination of other realities than the ones we know.
You're going to get me enemies. This is a question I ask. I don't have a strong opinion. I just have a feeling, and this might be discussed with you, that sometimes the news, at least in France, has invaded a little bit the fiction, and that novelists feel that they have to be very realistic, and that they have to be very close to the news. I mean, to what the people are going through to be read. And but I can't prove it. Don't have it's more of an impression.
Okay, let me perhaps go back to Goce and pick up that question of your hesitation to write the life of a real Japanese-American sculptor, and your feeling, I have to be too sort of faithful to the facts for me to do what I'd like to do. Have you sensed anything like that when you wrote about either Spinoza or Freud? Did you do a lot of research, or did you decide, no, I'm going to actually run with it?
Well, the research is very important, but it's very important after that to forget lots of that, lots of the facts, because it is a fiction. I know there's always people that would say, this is not real, you invented, and you don't have a right to do that to real persons. But then people really existed. But it is a novel, it is a fiction. It does not pretend to tell any truth, historical truth. So lots of the things are inventions, especially because even Spinoza, who was a well-known philosopher in his time, many of the things of his life are not recorded. And about Freud's sister Adolfina, we know almost nothing, although she lived until the middle of the past century. Simply, it had to be reconstructed. It was kind of a reconstruction with the imagination and not pretending to be intuitively finding the truth about this woman. There are just a few letters that remained after her a few photographies. There's letters in which Freud mentions her as the too sensitive person. And in the book of her nephew, Freud's son, Martin Freud, called Freud, Doctor and Father, this nephew pointed at her as a woman who was considered by the family as kind of silly and ridiculous because she remained dependent on her mother until the end of the life, that the mother maltreated her, that she was very depressive. And in the very next paragraph saying that unfortunately she died in the Holocaust. So the thing is that it was kind of, for me as a reader, of course, kind of cruel from a nephew to represent his aunt with these several sentences, knowing that she kind of sacrificed her life caring about her parents. So everything else was a reconstruction. We really have several facts about her. She had more sisters, and with the names of her sisters and with the dates of their birth and the dates of their death go the dates of the birth of their children, the dates of their marriages, the names of her children, their children, but she remains absolutely alone with her name, with the date of the birth, with the date of the death. And I felt this emptiness is not really empty. I really wanted to give a voice to her, and that's why I'm narrating the novel, but it is she who narrates. She has the voice. So for me, she was really a metaphor of the women deprived of their voices during the history. She gets the voice, yeah.
But maybe she's more a metaphor than really the sister of Freud.
She's a metaphor, but in the novel, she is in the situations that the history really had at the moment, yeah, and within the frame of the Freud's family, which is very well known. I mean, we know where Freud bought tobacco exactly. We know at what time he bought cigars. We know when he make a break from the treating of his patients. We know at which time he played cards with his friend. So the scenography was there because of the historical context and the context of the brother. But her life had to be somehow, I wouldn't say reconstructed, reimagined somehow. Yeah.
A foolish question, perhaps, or certainly. Why Freud's sister? There are hundreds and thousands of forgotten voices of women that were never seen by history. There is a reason, a non-trivial reason why it's Freud's sister. Could you tell us something about that?
Well, one of the reasons is that it was very clearly that this brother felt that it is a really sensitive sister. He pointed it in the letters. The other thing is what I already mentioned. What I felt, maybe it's very personal and a misunderstanding of Martin Freud when he was, I would say, cruel toward aunt. Mentioning that she was kind of, even we would feel that it's a joke for a family. Although at the same time, I mean, we have to make distinction between how we perceive women now and then, because at that time, today, a single woman would be a choice, understood as a moment of freedom. But then a personal choice. But then this kind of woman, a single woman at that time, had to live, of course, with the family. And it would be a joke for the neighborhood, a shame for the family, and the tragedy for ourselves. The percentage of suicides in the 19th century are among the women which were unmarried. Of course, even after all the research, it is more a fact. It is very hard to understand it. But through this particular destiny, I try to explain or to reimagine how it was. And because of you said, why this woman and not Freud? Maybe because, Freud said at the end of his life, women remained for me a dark continent. But it was a kind of alibi, because, he wrote not only in the essay on femininity, but many times that the woman, the character, the personality is based on envy and penis envy. And this envy is the central for everything the woman does. And if the woman can overcome this envy only if she has a son. And then if the son fulfills the aims she would fulfill if she was a male. So I think that Adolfine Freud in the novel is the one who gives a different perspective of a woman, that the woman should not have envy in the center of her being, that there could be vulnerability or joy or passion or anything else, and that the things are not that simple, that there's something in the core and everything is around, but the things are more complex. So I think she was the right person to be the metaphor, yeah.
Céline, can you imagine yourself, perhaps in the next novel, conquering your fear?
Fear of historical
Yeah,
figures?
and is there a forgotten brother of somebody who you could reinvent?
Whom I could write about? That's a good question. It's very hard to answer this. I think we were talking actually this morning, like what's the trigger? Why does a writer chooses one subject rather than another? And what is the trigger? Sometimes, Juan was talking before about reading this article about the hippo, and that was the trigger. I mean, I don't think I'm thinking in terms of historical novels or contemporary novels, or I'm just thinking of something that's just going to catch my attention. But it's true that I am a person who writes with her senses, and I need to be in a situation to write about it, or even to have my imagination running about it. It was Imam who said something very interesting during the seminar. She was trying to describe, I forgot which city, but where she had never been, and she didn't feel it worked completely. And I do have the same feeling, that if I were to set up a novel in a city where I'd never been, it would be difficult for me. It's me calling you. What? Oh, yeah.
Okay, the trigger, but no particular historical figure that you can think of. I mean, I'm reminded of Lytton Strachey was asked in Cambridge. They used to have the question there: which historical figure would you like to go to bed with?
And that's another question.
And he was expected to name a woman, and he said Julius Caesar, which.
Okay, but it's not about the historical figure; it's about the process. That, to me, is very. It stops my imagination. I feel overwhelmed by all the researches, all the documentation. But this is just my way of working. And it doesn't mean that inside the fiction I won't incorporate people who have existed or historical figure. It's not just the main, it's just I can't relate their experience.
And in conclusion, Goce, do you see yourself writing non-historical novels again?
Yes, I all the time take notes, but I think that the time is really fast, the time in which we live, and somehow I need the distance from this time. And I know that some writers, like Céline, she can do that more. Some writers like her can do it more easily, and to grasp the time. And I need to wait some time, and this time will come, I promise.
Okay, we'll hold our breath. Thank you very much, Goce, Smilevski and Céline Curiol. Okay, then I'd now like to invite Joke Hermsen to entertain us with her reflection on, her philosophical reflection on time. Joke Hermsen is well known to all of you, a Dutch novelist and philosopher, also a public philosopher who brings philosophy into the public sphere as a tool for curing our souls. As I said, she recently published this new book, Kairos, which continues the thoughts begun in the extremely successful Still the Tijd, published a couple of years ago. Without further ado, Joke, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have the rather impossible task to give you a mini lecture on time within 15 minutes. So luckily we have this huge clock. I don't wear a watch, but if you see it's 15 minutes past time, please give me a signal so I know when to stop. We have passed 3 wonderful days together in this house in Vásquez, and about many things I could say about it, but one's the most important. It was not long enough. We didn't have enough time to discuss time. Time is such a complex matter, it's such a mysterious phenomenon. Ever since Greek antiquity, ever since the first Greek philosophers, we are wondering about time, from the pre-Socrates until contemporary quantum physics. We still don't know exactly what time is. We cannot give a definition about time. It's still like Zeno wrote, the minute I start to describe time, it flies away. And then 1,000 years later we have St. Augustine, who wrote maybe the most beautiful pages on time in his book, The Confessions. And he studied time, and he said, I don't understand it. If nobody asks me what time is, I know very well what it is. But the minute someone asks me, well, tell me, what is time? I don't know it anymore. I can't find the words to describe it. So please don't expect from me that I can enlighten you on time in 15 minutes, because I can't. But I will try to do one very small thing in this short track of time. I will try to make you conscious of a very old philosophical idea which we, at the beginning of the 21st century, seem to have forgotten. It is a very old Greek idea. We can find with Heraclitus, with Plato, with Aristoteles. And that is the idea that the time has not only one face, one aspect, as we know it so well, the clock time, the chronological time, but that time has 2 faces, 2 aspects. This difference between these 2 dimensions or 2 aspects of time, we could describe as the difference between measuring time, as is done behind my back, and experiencing time. Now, this difference between measuring and experiencing is already a distinction we sometimes tend to forget within contemporary science, for instance. We think that all we can know is what we can measure. But long time, there was a rather strict distinction between what we could measure and what we could experience. Now, these two phases of time that I would like to share with you tonight has something to do with this distinction. On the one hand, we have Chronos. We know him, everybody knows him. Chronos is the chronological time. It's the linear time. Chronos is the time, in fact, our clock time derives from. Chronos can be seen as the horizontal line of time. It's the linear succession of moments of time. And we, as human beings, try to make it possible to measure this time. How we did it, we cut a day in 24 hours, an hour in 60 minutes, and a minute in 60 seconds, so we can be precisely sure about what time it is. Time didn't do this itself, I mean. That's why the same writer, Juan, already mentioned, W.G. Sebald, once wrote that the most artificial invention of humankind is precisely the clock time. Because time isn't cut into pieces. I don't see anyone in front of me jumping from 1 minute into another. We cut the time in pieces in order to be able to measure it. And why did we do that? Because you wanted to use it as an instrument to organize the world, to structure the world, to be able to organize these kinds of events. You have to cut it in pieces in order to say, well, at 8:15 starts the passa porta event on time. I mean, it would have been a problem for passa porta if we didn't have the clock time to gather you all around here at a certain moment of time. So it's a practical, social, worldly aspect of time. Very practical, urgent even, necessary. Ever since we organized modern transport. I mean, we can't make a train or an airplane function without this clock time. But then there is a big but. For the Greek, this was not the only god of time. He had a grandson. And the point of my last book, and even of the book before already, is that we modern Western 21st century people seem to have forgotten this other aspect of time, which for the Greek was the most important, even the only real, the only truthful aspect of time. And this grandson of Kronos was not an old man with a beard who measured time, and he had, how do you call it, zandloper? Thank you, in his hand. No, this grandson is a young and very muscled, very strong god. He has wings on his shoulders and wings on his feet because he makes you fly. It's the god of the inspiration. It's the god that gives wings to your thoughts. It's the god of creativity, of change, of radical change. Sorry? Oh, I thought I heard a comment. That's all right. I mean, if anybody has a question, no. Maybe later then. This grandson of Kronos was called Kairos. Now, everybody knows Kronos, but nobody seems to know anymore. Kairos? Never heard of. Who's that then? Well, that's a strange thing that happened to this strong and muscled and winged god of time who used to be the truthful aspect of time because he disappeared. In my research, it's Erasmus who wrote the last chapter on Kairos in his Adagia from 1508. So he starts within the pre-Socratics until, through the Middle Ages, until Erasmus, 16th century, this other aspect of time was seen not only as a time of creativity, but also as the time you really needed to take the good decision. Even for doctors. From Hippocrates until the medieval doctors, the Kairos time was the time of the good attention, the time when you really focus, when you really observe very well, when you really look upon all the possible arguments that accompany your decision, when you really have a good look on the whole specific context. That's why he's always represented as a very concentrated figure. You know, he's usually standing like this all the time. And he's not measuring time, he has a balance, weegschaal, a balance in his hand, because he is balancing the right conditions, the right arguments, the right decisions. He was called the god of the right moment, the momentum. He was called the god of the right decision, the right measure, the right action. And without it, Erasmus still wrote, you should not take a decision at all. Now, how come this other side of God, which is the God we experience personally, because that's a big difference also. You know, chronos is the time, the clock time is the time that is told to you. It is the external time. It's the universal time. It has to be universal, otherwise we can't use our clocks. But this other time, this experiencing of time, is the time which, as Bergson wrote, is the inner experience and the subjective. It's our own being in time. That's another difference between Chronos and Kairos. It's the difference between having time, or like we mostly thinking that we don't have time, and being time ourselves. That is the other difference. Well, this Kairos God disappears, I think, under the pressure of rationalism during the 17th and 18th century. And then he comes back. It's a comeback hit, this Kairos, because after 3 centuries he comes back, and where, of course, he comes back in the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. When Nietzsche is describing creativity, when Nietzsche is describing that there's not a lack of talent, there's the lack of the hand who can grasp the hairlock which is falling in front of the forehead of Kairos, because he has a very strange haircut. He has a punk haircut, this Kairos God. It's bald, but it has only one hairlock, because if you are in the Kairos moment, you cannot wait. You have to grasp him at his hairlock. The condition, on the contrary, to experience this other time is scholer in Greek. Well, scholer means taking a rest, taking a break, taking an interval, an intermezzo, doing nothing, rest. First, you have to rest. You have to focus your attention, your concentration. And then it can happen that Kairos leads you into this interval of time, this time of the in-between, the meantime time, the Zwischenzeit. And within this interval, everything can change. Because what's happening within this interval of time, and maybe you recognize it. If you're focusing very well, or if you are having your attention very good focused, or if you are painting, or writing, or reading, or listening to music, or daydreaming, or walking, and you forget about Chronos, you forget about the clock, you experience another kind of time, a time that is nothing to do with scarcity of time, or a lack of time, or an acceleration of time. It's not a time that makes you unrest. It's a time that feels better, more comfortable, richer. And it's this interval of time that we can call the Kairos moment. It has been called the Kairos moment. And I think it is a time of creativity, most of all. Because what happens within the interval is not only that we forget the clock time, we also forget all the other rumors of everyday life. We for a moment of time, forget all our worries, all our practical worries. We have this inner experience, and within this experience of time, we encounter ourselves, as so to speak. We make another relation to this self. And I think it's from this self that we can create something. And in this interval of time, Henri Bergson wrote, there's nothing like the clock time. Forget about the clock time. It's like William Faulkner, who wrote, the true time comes only to life when the clocks are silent. It is the time of concentration. And within this time, we experience this other time, which you can call an inner experience of time, and he calls it le temps comme durée. Durée, it means this is a time that is not interrupted by our moments of time. I don't know how many minutes I have. You are the one who's watching my time. Eh? So give me a signal when it's almost over. This time, comme durée, it's a continuous flow of time. It remembers Heraclitus, you know, the pre-Socratic philosopher who wrote the Pantarei, everything streams, everything flows, and time itself is something that dures and flows. And then we have these Hungarian psychologists who describe inspiration, attention, with this word flow. I don't know if you've heard of him. He has a very difficult name to pronounce, but I will try. It's called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And he wrote all about flow, about when are people the most happy. And he described this happiness under the title flow. And when you are in flow, you indeed forget the clock time, you forget the worries, you are so focused on the thing you are doing or dreaming or making or meditating on or daydreaming on, that you feel less alone towards yourself, less alone towards the world. It's like if you are able to make a connection to everything that's around you. He describes flow also as the just balance, and there we have the kairos balance again, the just balance between your capacities, or everything you have already done, or made, or sang, or wrote, or everything you did, and the thing you not yet realized, the thing that's still pure possibility. It's not too much of a possibility that it becomes an impossibility, it's just the right balance. And this is in between, what they call the kairotic interval. It's there where you can change, it's there where you make something new. It's there where Sigrid starts to wave, meaning my time's up. So you see, it was an impossible task they gave me. They asked me to talk to you about the largest mystery of humankind, which is time, but I only hope, that's my task as a philosopher and a writer, and I make you conscious of this other aspect of time. And I don't care how you name it, as long as you realize how important it is for your well-being, mentally and also creatively. Well, I hope you got a lot of inspiration here from my wonderful colleagues for the rest of the evening. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that piece of stand-up philosophy, Joke, which I'm sure will have inspired everybody here. Next to the program is a conversation with two novelists that also joined us at the seminar. The Lebanese anthropologist and novelist Iman Humaydan, who's published 3 novels to date, B as in Beirut, Wild Mulberries, and recently published in English, Other Lives. And she is joined by our very own Belgian author Anne Provoost, whose novel Falling, I should say, has been made into a very successful feature film, as many of you will know. Other translated work is The Shadow of the Ark, which, as in the other one, tells a story very much written from the perspective of a child or a young adult. She tries to really bridge that artificial gap between young adult fiction and adult fiction. Can I invite you both on the stage, please? I should say now already perhaps that if you want a drink, there are little bottles under the table. Should you? Okay, in our talks over the past 2 days, one of the things that very often came up and possibly was triggered by Juan Gabriel Vásquez's keynote, which he delivered at the start of the seminar, and part of which we just heard, the reference to Chekhov's statement that the novel's business is to ask questions rather than to give answers. Juan told us that the novel is a novel to the extent that it asks moral questions, and both moral and questions are the operative terms here. It's got to be moral, but it has to be of the order of the question, perhaps, rather than the answer. That's the question. That's the question we were thinking about. We've been talking about unanswerable questions, questionable answers, and we weren't quite sure always how we were locating fiction in relation to that realm. Girls, tell me about it. You've got your mics.
Do I have to start? Good evening. Yeah, well, we're here tonight to tell you about what happened while we were sitting together and talking all the time. You don't want to know all about what happened, but some of it. And indeed, I think while we were asked what we expected from the seminar and how we were looking at things and what our big issues were. And I think that it was right after Juan's keynote that you just heard that indeed this Chekhov saying came up, saying that, we are not answering questions in our books. We're not, what is it? We're asking interesting questions, we're not answering them. And I had the cold sweat immediately because I told the group that this is the question of my life, and it's a saying, a statement that I've been fighting against all my life, because my appeal that I made to the group as writers was that I found it dangerous for us to continue saying as authors that we are not answering any questions. And the reasoning behind it, I'll try to explain you briefly, is that I'm a little bit worried about artists that keep telling their audiences about what they do not do. Because it makes us easy targets for other products that are also called literature that will tell the readers all the time what they're doing. They're entertaining them and they're winning big prizes or they're selling well. While if we continue to say that all we do is asking questions, we're making ourselves vulnerable in the sense that I, as a reader, take up a book because I am already full of questions. And I am in the book looking for answers. So if then I meet an author who says, well, I'm not giving you the answers, I feel that the author is telling me I'm naked as well. I don't know it either. And that disappoints me. So when I look for novels, when I look for the titles I'm going to read, I am searching answers. I wish to receive more than an author who tells me, because there's a big difference, of course, between what the author does in his book and how he communicates about his books when he gives interviews. My opinion is that the author comes to the audience and that he tells me what he stands for. And I understand authors who will say, well, we don't want to give a message. I think what they mean is we don't always want to give a politically correct message. But the message that I would wish to receive from authors is not a message like the message of the Bible or how I have to live, but it's more the coded message of aliens in Star Trek, you know. They send messages and it's up to me to decode them. So my appeal that I made to the group was, let's stop telling our readers that we do not have messages, but let's tell them that there's a message on each page, or there's 500 messages on each page. And I think it's even clearer if you would look at poetry, where I think poetry is full of messages, but they're ze zijn niet ontcijferd, they're not decoded. And the author makes an appeal to me, asks me, almost demands from me that I decode. And that, for me, is a smarter way of promoting literature, because we always assume that the people, for example, from Passa Porta will tell the readers how important it is to read. But we're not supporting the people from Passa Porta if we keep telling our readers, well, you know, I don't know it either. Because sometimes I worry that it's a sort of cynicism. It's like saying, well, I'll ask you the questions and then I'll leave. You know, I've done my task. For me, the author hasn't done her task if she's just told me that she doesn't know the answer either. I would like to get answers. I would like to also have the feeling that I can contradict her. That's an important difference. I call it in Dutch buigzaam gelijk. It's a, what is it in English? A bendable, flexible way of telling people, well, this is what I stand for, but do contradict me if you wish.
Iman, you want to?
Well, it's very interesting what Anne was saying. Good evening. Okay, first of all, to write a novel is to be in connectedness with yourself, to find yourself. Nobody writes a novel to make a service for the humanity or for the society a writer is living in. We start with ourselves first. And I'd like to talk about my experience in order for you to understand why I took this stand that the writer asks questions and he might not find answers for his questions. I grew up in a society where very early in my life I saw everything collapsing around me. To start with my family, who migrated 90% of them to the United States because they come from a family who was anti-power. My father was he was a very political activist, and he wasn't friendly with the authorities in my country. So my brothers and sisters left. My mother died, and the war started when I was like 17 years old. And I was brought up on in a very high moralistic level of seeing the world. Like, there is black and white, there is bad and good, and there is truth and non-truth. And then at a moment, I discovered that I should start from zero, because all what I've learned in my life, I didn't see, I didn't experience. I experienced something else. And at that moment, I felt I need to write. I need to write to try to rebuild my own world, because it was collapsing. And I was collapsing, it's collapsing also. That's why I started my first novel during the Lebanese civil war, which dured 15 years, from 1975 to 1990. I was trying to understand why it happened, why a neighbor kills his neighbor in the night, a neighbor that he lived with for 40 years. And they used to eat every morning together and go holidays together. And then when the war started, all this violence came out. And that's why I had a lot of questions. I didn't have answers. But why I asked these questions and I didn't ask other kind of questions? Why I asked about violence and I didn't ask about the style of women? Because that's what really concerns me. And that's what I want to communicate with the world around me about them. And in this way, and I think it was a way of finding the answers at the same time. Like when I deal with topics of violence, of voiceless women, as Goce tried to do in his novel on Freud's sister, about marginal people. It's also a way of rebuilding the world the way I want. And this is a part of the answer. I don't know if it's enough what I said.
It's never going to be enough, but it's. I take it on that what you're telling us, and I think what Iman says confirms that the message, if there is a message, is in the process rather than in the product. It's the decoding that somehow generates the kind of change that an author could seek to create in their reader. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, but I would dare to take it a little step further, because there's not eternal liberty in the way you interpret my words. You are free to a certain extent, but this is, of course, what makes our kind of art so different from visual art, or, for example, a painting. In a painting, it's green is green, and you can put a meaning into it, but it doesn't have a meaning per se. In language, we don't only have a structure and a shape and the beauty of the use of our language, but every word we use has a meaning. And sometimes a meaning is it's possible to interpret it, but there's limits to how far the interpretation goes. So maybe I can give you an example of out of one of my books, because you mentioned that one of my books was made into a movie. Now, in this book, Falling, I very much focus on how a young adult is tempted by extremist thoughts and how he falls in the lure, in the fall of the right extremism. I am really getting into the skin of that boy. I am very empathetic. I try to understand him. And I try to understand why he throws a Molotov cocktail at the Center for Asylum Seekers. When we signed the contract for the movie, the director, Hans Herbots, talked with me, and he said, do you want particular things in the contract? Well, of course, you have a contract together. And I said, the only thing that I want to be sure of is I want to get to know you, because I want to make sure that you are the right interpreter of my text, because there are messages in my book. I ask questions, but there are messages, because I could not know whether this man was going to focus on the fact that this boy was trapped in right extremism, or that this boy who was an anti-hero in my book, or he would change this in a hero. I didn't assume he would, but what I'm trying to say is that to me there are limits to the extent that you as a reader interpret my book. And I think that goes for very many of us. We give a lot of liberty. I sometimes compare my books to a box of Lego. not Playmobil, because there everything is ready-made, but Lego. And I give this box to the reader, but before I offer the reader the box, I shake the box. So, and there's no handleiding, what do you call it? Instructions that come with the box. So I will allow, if this, I know what is in the box. If this was a Lego house, I think I can accept that they built a completely different house, and maybe they can even build, say, a ship with it. But the moment they try to shape a ball, I may say, hang on, this interpretation is going too far. So as long as I realize that this plays with me, that I have limitations, that I feel that I have this reflex as soon as somebody tries to do something with my book, I must admit to myself that I have not only asked questions, but that I have taken a stand and that I have shown my face to the reader and said, this is what I defend. So I can clearly see that when you're in the middle of a situation, that you are less ready to say, I know what the shape is of the Lego, and I know what the reader has to read in it. But it would be a question to you, Iman. Would you say that even if you approach your books with all your questions, that you have limits to the possibilities of interpretation that you're giving to the reader?
Questions or answers, you mean? You said questions.
Oh, sorry, to the answers.
Okay. Well, my relationship with the reader, I think it's different. I don't feel myself I know more than the reader. I think writing a book and then be read by readers, it's a long journey that we do together. And especially when I read critique on my book, sometimes I feel the critique is more intelligent than me. The way they read the book, the way the book sends its messages. The book sends the messages, not me, to the reader. The way the reader understands me. Sometimes he understands me more than I understand myself. And with every page I write, it's a step forward to understand myself more. And more than that, to be more courageous, to make a hole in this big, huge wall of taboos that I'm living in my country. As first as a female writer, and second as a person who doesn't even enjoy citoyenneté, because there is this notion in Lebanon. Human beings are subjects. And it's an experience that every day I feel I'm becoming freer, and this makes me more modest in the relationship with the reader. Sometimes a reader might teach me a lot of things, and I'm ready to learn.
Could I ask both of you a general question about the tradition of the novel, of the form that you're working in? You told us yesterday, Iman, that in your reading, in fact, the Lebanese novel as a genre in its own right came into existence as a result of the Civil War. It's the Civil War that created that genre. And Juan told us that in your anxious thinking sometimes, the novel is a genre that's coming to an end, that is no longer viable. Could you both tell me something about where you think the genre is going, and what your relation to the history of that genre is, not just your own writing, but the flow of writing that you're part of?
In Lebanon, we had very few novels before the 70s, of course, but very, very few. But they drew, in a way or another, the big road that led people like me to enjoy writing novels now and to be able to express themselves. But what the Civil War did is that it, first of all, it put under question all the for granted values that we had before the war. To start with the image that Lebanon was always trying to present itself to the world, like a transit country, a touristic country, without paying any attention to the peripheral areas, to the marginal people, to women, without really paying attention to the public services that it should be provided to everyone. So the person who has money can go to the university and the poor one should stick to the village. All these values, the war has broke them down. And, but the problem was that they were broken down, but it took a long time, even till now, that we didn't build other values. And at this moment, there was nothing but art and literature to step forward and reflect the voice of these marginal people. It was through the art and the literature, and now, since 4 years, through also the Lebanese cinema. To say, first of all, to ask questions, because we don't believe anymore in what has been imposed on us, to ask new questions, but it's not necessarily that we know the answers. What kind of a country we want? Why there was that size of violence? And the very interesting thing that who really asked deep questions were women. Now the Lebanese novel, more than 50% of writers are, of novelists are women. Even in the cinema industry, directors, there are women. And this is a very important thing that we should really consider, because these were the voiceless before the war.
Yeah, I think there you're hitting something very important. I think we will need the novel forever to solve that kind of mental exercises that we make in times of crisis. And I'm using that introduction to jump to your question, because that's another issue that we talked about, is if you're talking about time, you're also talking about the future. And the question came to the table whether the novel had a future. And I think I kind of shocked people by saying that I thought we had reached the final stage of the novel, by which I never meant that we would not write nor read novels anymore. But what I meant when I said that we had reached the final stage, it's an arrogant way of thinking, of course, because people always think that they live in the last time. But I think I can defend that point of view to some extent, in the sense that I think that whatever could be tried with the novel as genre has more or less been done. We have tried to be very experimental. We have tried to be very conservative. We have tried to all kinds of times and perspectives, and written from the point of view of a towel, whatever. I think we will continue to do that, and we will endlessly keep on making variations, but I don't expect that there's going to be spectacular new things coming into the novel. I mean, you could still invent a novel where when you turn the page, some music comes up or something technical. But what we can do with language, to me, it feels like we have reached limits because we have tried everything. And how come that I feel that this would be the final stage and not 20 years ago or not in 30 years? I think there's a massive, massive democratization of literature. It's the cheapest expression of art that you can think of. I mean, if you want to paint, you have to buy paint. If you want to be a writer, all you need is a pen and a paper. Of course, that's theoretical because already you need computers. But what I mean to say is that it's the most democratic, it's the easiest art to step into, because I know that there are a few people that know how to draw without taking lessons. But it's almost assumed, and it's almost a must. I mean, even in Belgium and many countries, we talked about that also. The assumption is that you cannot possibly learn it. So the assumption behind that is that everybody can try it, even if they haven't learned it, because you cannot learn it anyway. So in a sense, everybody's writing, which means that an enormous amount of books are being written today in the world. I think Yoko would be able to tell us more about that. They once took a poll in the Netherlands of how many people said they were writing, and I think they reached like 1 million people in the Netherlands are writing in any way possible. I rejoice that. I think that is just, if we're talking about democratization, if we're talking about, what do you call it, mondig maken, making sure that people can verbalize, that they can be pronounced, this is the way to go. But it also means that at this moment, all the experiments that we are thinking of, that we can think of, are being executed. So I think forever the novel will exist, but we will endlessly make variations, and what will happen to the novel will be exactly what you said. We will hear very new voices, groups of people that we had never heard, the women in certain areas, people who live in remote areas where before there wasn't any access to libraries, to pens, to computers. We will hear new ways of telling new stories, new things that will happen to us. But the language will have its limits. We will always be linked to a perspective, and we will be able to play that with that perspective. We are stuck to a certain time, telling time, verteltijd, and we're going to play with that. We're stuck to the meaning of words, and we're going to play with them. We will have people who write books that you can read from front to back and that you can read backwards. We have also, I think in the Netherlands, had a novel where a novelist did nothing but tear sentences out of other novels and made a new novel with nothing but sentences from existing novels. So ever since the 15th, 16th century, people have experimented with language. They've experimented much later on. This was with the novel. I don't, to be honest, see many more possibilities, but contradict me if I'm wrong, because I would rejoice it if somebody could come up with something we've never seen before.
Okay, we have our task cut out for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is the Danish author Christian Grøndahl, author of too many novels for me to mention them. I just note Silence in October and An Altered Light. And he regaled us with a very inspiring talk yesterday, part of which he will now bring for us in conclusion to the formal events.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us to this event, which is a very special invitation because normally writers are invited to speak and to read, as I will in a moment. But this time we were also invited to listen, which is rare. And the wonderful thing was that we shared the joy of listening to one another. For once, as writers, we were allowed to just listen to what the others had to say and respond, and by way of responding, discovering that sometimes we can say something else than we normally do. Because as a writer being a public figure, you sometimes have the feeling that you just reproduce yourself. And reproducing yourself has little to do with what literature is about. So this listening part of our days together really reminded me what it's also about, which has to do with listening, and not only listening to the others, but also hearing how you yourself slowly is perhaps moving somewhere else, discovering that what you assumed might not be just what you thought it was. So paradoxically, I will now read, but in doing so, I will ask you to remember that my greatest, the greatest gift of having been here really was not to be able to stand here and talk to you, but it was to sit and listen to the others. And I will read part of what was my contribution during these days, which has to do with time in many different ways. And my job was to try to relate to the relationship between news and the writer, the concept of news, of current events, and what it means to write literature. Literature is never a pastime hors du temps. On the contrary, any literary work has the date stamped on it, even the classics, especially the classics. Only the makers of kitsch opt for eternity. You may hope to have readers after you've gone, but you will only have left something behind you for others to read if you were driven by an urge as an artist to grasp and capture, to feel and find the adequate means to express what it was like to be present right there, right then. Not how authors before you would have said it, but how it sounds today. Not in order to make literature the way it was made before you were born, but in order to rekindle a spontaneous relationship between language and the world. In the words of the critic and essayist Logan Pearsall Smith, the great art of writing is the art of making people real to themselves with words. That you cannot do once and for all. It must be done time and again, each generation awakening to the fact of their specific shared experiences. Baudelaire, for one, would insist on the importance of being contemporary, and in his essay, The Painter of Modern Life, he celebrates the artist roaming the streets with a sensitive awareness of the slightest changes in fashion. To embrace transscience and translate one's historical moment, what you have actually known and seen, into something slightly more durable, a string of sentences, a narrative, a book. That is what a writer does, and he or she can only do it, can only resist impermanence by plunging into it. As for novels, they suffocate without detail. The hues and scents, the manners and inflections of real places and people at a specific junction of historical time and space. Details remain a vital part of their fascination, regardless of all literary measures, the traces left of what once was. So the question for a writer is not whether he or she is a product of history, but whether that notion, apart from being our fate, should also be a vocation. Making people real to themselves with words. That phrase presupposes that without them we're somehow unreal, as if we hadn't arrived yet to the reality of the moment we're living through. In itself, it is indeed a historical notion, the belief that there is such a thing as a shared present tense in which we recognize our fellow humans as our contemporaries in more than a physical sense. One might certainly argue that people have always lived in separate time bubbles, frames of mind set apart from one another, and widely so in terms of knowledge, culture, and values. It is nevertheless a recurrent thought that one should be awake and attentive to a shared perception of where we are in time, if not where we are going. It seems inherent to the mentality of democratic culture to think so, and I don't care if it's just a product of historical contingency. I feel the impulse myself, and at least the feeling is real. But how to do it? How do you find the words that will make people feel real to themselves, perhaps even to one another? In the 19th century, you would subscribe to the idea that art and literature were universal.
The approach of humanism was to see both as spiritual forces which might release us from our cultural contingencies, the specifics of class, ethnicity, religion, and so forth, in order to recognize what we have in common in spite of all our differences. A deeply Christian thought transformed into the secularized romantic vision of the artist as redeemer. In the 20th century, you would probably sign up for the creed that art and literature can be new in a radical sense, the unheard of, that which breaks the patterns of tradition, disappointing our expectations in order to replace them with what we didn't know that we were craving for, provocation as an eye-opener, scandal as purgatory on our way to enlightenment, the artist as herald of things to come. All of these are relics of an avant-gardism which is now, ironically, behind us. But there was a time, 100 years ago, when art was new and when its newness had become the last remaining criterion of its cultural relevance. To be contemporary was only a beginning. The artist had seen the future and didn't know yet that it was murder. For a few years, Russian avant-garde painters and poets would believe that they were teachers, not victims to be, of the revolution. So where do we go as writers after humanism and after the cult of the new? We no longer believe in the universalism of the true, the good, and the beautiful, and what is more, no one knows about any of that any longer, education having lost its ideal purpose, eager now to accommodate the shifting needs of the globalized market. But we also seem out of touch with the cheeky faith in themselves, so characteristic of the writers of modernism, relying not only on the tradition which they were questioning, much the way rebellious children rely on the vitality of their fathers, but also buttressing themselves with the authority of the new. My own life as a person and a writer was shaped and marked by two events. I was 30 years to the day when the Berlin Wall came down, and as I woke up to adulthood from a youth spent under the spell of Cold War antagonisms, it seemed as if European culture was celebrating the reunion of East and West with the return of humanist notions such as the universalism of art and democracy. With Václav Havel installed in the Castle of Prague, one would be excused to think so, but the vanity of such notions was brutally and abruptly laid bare some 10 years later in Manhattan on a clear day in September. The war on terror and all the terrible mistakes made in its name seem to have confirmed the deconstructive skeptics of postmodernism in their relativist attitude to the universalism of justice, beauty, and meaning. And not only have we been witnessing a political meltdown of hopes spurred by the downfall of communism, we have also seen how the art of writing has become increasingly marginalized by market forces in combination with the failure to insist on a central role for literature within education. Justly so, one might add, concluding that it was only right for Havel the author to become Havel the president. Only in a totalitarian society does the writer have a role to play as a clandestine moral reference. In a democracy, writers are just citizens like everyone else, providers of a slightly more sophisticated sort of entertainment. And I would gladly resign myself to that, having seen the hopes of 1989 go up in flames on 9/11, were it not for the restlessness taking hold of me. A ridiculous but persisting defiance on behalf of this art of making people real to themselves with words. Every time I meet with readers, I am reminded that as writers, even as writers in postmodern democracies, we still have a different perspective to offer. And I recognize once more how that perspective of literary writing has to do with redeeming the banality of individual experience. I have little faith in the grand abstract humanism of old, but I'm appalled by the cynical conclusion to recent history, which has it that democracy is a European speciality unsuited for exploitation. I'm not at all attracted to the worn-out avant-garde strategies which see transparency, narrative, identification, and coherence as sell-out measures, taking refuge in opacity and affectation, turning literature into some sort of Freemasonry. But I am equally repelled by the inanity of a market culture where art and literature are mere ornament, something which can easily be dispensed with. And I'm heartened by the fact that there are still readers out there who need words to make themselves real, to make them feel real to themselves. I am myself such a reader. Speaking of news and the writer, it is fair to remember that events, even dramatical ones, are not alone in adding up the crucial characteristics of a given historical moment. Literary narratives are also a language of the pauses, the silence, and the cavities where something otherwise hidden can make itself felt. And when public events bring real change, one is left to ask if the world is still ours or if it's becoming someone else's. News are always about the power and values, and I don't think that it is literature's job to celebrate change for its own sake. I rather think that writing has to do with counting the dead, overcoming our losses, and integrating change, even devastating ones, into the story of who we are. Each generation of writers will have inherited a language in the widest sense of that word, and first they have to take possession of it, make it express their unique historical experience. Secondly, they will have to share it. Open up the words again for others to feel real too. This is the process by which a language stays alive, old and yet forever young. And in that process, it becomes clear that for literature, news are not identical with the events being told, and they are not the telling either. The more or less original, more or less inventive play with form and genre. In literature, we are the news, we the writers. We always were.